but I would see my students become really empowered intellectually and politically, but still fall into the abusive relationships or the eating disorders or the addictions, as did I. I did all of those things, which said to me, we're missing something here, right?
Mm-hmm.
That if we can empower our students so much and they're out there being change agents, but there's a piece in their own bodies and hearts and lives that it isn't able to seep into, then we're missing a piece. And for me, I think that piece is embodiment.
Hi, and welcome to Yoga Stories Project. Each session, I talk with yogis about their life and practice. I do this to inspire and empower you to bring yoga and mindfulness into your life. Who am I? I'm Hunter Clark-Fields, Mindfulness Mama Mentor. I coach smart, accomplished, overstressed moms on how to cultivate mindfulness in their daily lives. I've been practicing yoga and mindfulness for over 20 years and have taught thousands of women worldwide. Hey there, I'm so glad you're here. I'm glad you're here for this episode of Yoga Stories Project. I'm coming at you straight from Delaware, where you might be able to hear some crazy cicadas in the background. And I have a great episode for you today. This is an interview episode, and this is episode 47, I think. And it's with Beth Berila, and it's about how feminism and yoga come together and really kind of disrupt the old harmful standards. And I think you're going to really like this episode. And I wanted to go and thank a listener for an iTunes review, but oh my gosh. So I went over there to look, and we're in the process of kind of moving Yoga Stories Project onto a different server so I can upgrade and get better statistics and all these kinds of things and grow the podcast and make it great and all that stuff. And I went over to iTunes, and all of my old episodes are not there at the moment. Oh my gosh. It has switching over is completely, for the moment, erased all my old episodes from iTunes. So I am really needing some iTunes reviews, because it's also erased all my old iTunes reviews, which really makes me so sad. So actually, Yoga Stories Project currently has no reviews. So I would really appreciate it if you ever thought of giving Yoga Stories Project a review. Really, now is the time. I'd love your honest review. And if you do and you want to, you can email me your review at hunter@hunteryoga.com, and I will actually write you a handwritten thank you note. So you just have to email me your address, hunter@hunteryoga.com, and I really love connecting with you via real tangible stuff. Very cool. So this is a great episode. You're going to love it. Before we dive in, I want to thank our sponsor for this episode, Present Mama Community. This month in Present Mama Community, I'm giving the mamas, the tribe, a really in-depth teaching and practice in how to take care of anger. And this is something that I've been really honest about, that I have a temper and I've struggled with, and I really want to help people. So I'm excited about this teaching. So Present Mama Community has all these wonderful yoga, meditations, and conscious parenting lessons, and and we have these group coaching calls, monthly group coaching calls. So it's a real support service out there for you. And I have one more thing to announce, which is really cool. I am wrapping up my mindful parenting course, and I'm so excited about it. And if you want to get the in on it, the early in, you can go to mindfulparentingcourse.com. Okay, so I know you're going to love this episode. I want you to just dive right in and enjoy. Hi, Hunter here, and welcome to Yoga Stories Project. Today, I'm talking to Beth Berila, and Beth is the director of the Women's Studies program at St. Cloud University, and she's also a registered yoga teacher and an Ayurvedic yoga specialist. She's a member of the leadership team of the Yoga and Body Image Coalition, which is how I heard about Beth. You may have listened to my interview with Kimberly Dark, also a Yoga and Body Image Coalition founder. She works to make yoga accessible to everybody by challenging the lack of diversity in mainstream Western yoga culture. Beth's current project merge yoga and meditation practices with feminism and mindful education to create a form of socially engaged and embodied learning. Sounds really cool to me. I can't wait to hear about it, Beth.
Thanks, Hunter. Thanks. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, welcome to Yoga Stories Project.
Thank you. And great acts to follow. Kimberly Dark, for instance, wonderful.
Yeah. I think that body image is such an important thing for us to talk about, when it comes to yoga, because it's such an embodied practice, and it brings people to so many different conclusions about their bodies in so many different ways, and it just feels like something that really needs to be talked about more.
Yes, absolutely. And through the work of the Yoga Body Image Coalition and many other similar organizations, those conversations are actually happening more and more. I think that so many people in this, in the United States, especially women, learn from a very young age, I know I did, that their worth is tied to how they look, and how they look has to fit a particular standard for them to be considered worthy, right? So, and we see that standard actually upheld in a lot of the contemporary yoga world. So thin, traditionally beautiful, which means, perfect skin, perfect features, it's a very white standard of beauty. And so I know when I was growing up, I certainly was incredibly loved by my family, but I was also saturated by all those media images, right? And I learned to judge my worth from the outside in, right? To be very aware of how other people saw me, and to determine my standing in the community based on that more so than my own self-worth. And one of the gifts that yoga allows us to do is begin to see how those internalized messages really shape us, and to begin to let them go and start to embrace more empowering narratives.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can totally relate to where you are, where I had a family who loved me very much, and, my dad complimented me on my cute nose, I mean, it was all very, very cool, but absolutely absorbed all those things. It's funny because when I think about yoga and body image, for me, I fit the sort of traditional, I'm very flexible and I'm thin and things like that, but it's not like it skips over anybody. It's kind of like this. Our culture is like this, seems to be like this juggernaut that just hits all of us. I mean, especially at those young ages. I can absolutely remember being in front of my mirror and, hating my body. It's such a shame because, we're not just minds and hearts. We're embodied, physical flesh and blood mammals, and we need to learn about that and live from that place.
Well, and I think that the point you just mentioned, that even the people who fit or pretty closely align with that standard still don't feel like they're enough, right? And that's a sign that this culture that we live in creates standards that doesn't serve anybody, even people who are fairly rewarded by it. And it particularly doesn't serve the people who that standard was never designed to fit. So, people who are in marginalized groups like the queer community, or communities of color, or people who are living with disabilities, people who have so much valuable experiences and so much beauty in their own right, but that narrow standard doesn't usually include them. And it's unfortunately being replicated in the U.S. mainstream yoga world. But the practice itself doesn't have to uphold those standards. In fact, the practice itself allows us to disrupt a lot of those standards and come to a much more empowered way of being in the world and relating to one another.
Well, so how does yoga do that then? How does the yoga practice itself disrupt those standards? Because I know that for many people, they go into, especially maybe a certain type of studio where every single person like looks amazing, and they're all super thin, and they're all super fit, and they're all, doing everything, and they're very intense, So if somebody goes into a situation like that, how is this practice going to help them disrupt those standards?
Sure. Good question. I guess the first suggestion I would make is to not go to those spaces. That to search out some of the many incredible people who are creating different kinds of yoga spaces. So, for instance, a lot of the people affiliated with the Yoga Body Image Coalition or with Off the Mat Into the World. There are a growing number of people who are doing curvy yoga or yoga for people of color or accessible yoga, and really try to search those out if they're in your area or even online, because they will intentionally try to create spaces that disrupt that level of inaccessibility that you were just describing. So that's the first step. The second step, in terms of the practice itself, so yoga invites us to come to our embodied experience, as you mentioned. And as we sort of come to our mat and we sink into our body, we begin to breathe deeply, we maybe let go of all the, multitasking of our day. As we start to go through the practice, we're going to start to notice the kind of self-talk that comes up. And it's this is what feminism teaches. It's all learned self-talk, right? So when you start, asking yourself, judging yourself for not being able to do a particular pose, or comparing yourself to the person next to you, or wondering if, your yoga clothes are stylish enough, or being, that would be one example. You can start to recognize that those storylines are not the truth. They are learned behavior that the culture around us has taught us. And in fact, they don't serve us. They don't empower us. So the first thing is to recognize the narrative. The second is to breathe and try to create a little bit of space between what the story that you're thinking and your feelings about it. Begin to reflect on your feelings about it. Like, how do they actually make you feel? Do they make you feel whole, or do they make you feel smaller? And then begin to maybe send yourself some loving kindness or some more empowering stories like, hey, you got to your mat today. Look at all the awesome things you can do right now. You are worthy just because you are here, kind of things. And typically by the end of a practice, and of course there are other steps in that process that we can talk about, but by the end of the practice, when people feel really good in Shavasana, part of that is because you have begun, even momentarily, even just for a moment, to come back to your wholeness underneath all of those learned behaviors. And the more you can cultivate some of that on your mat, the more accessible it can be off your mat.
I love this. I mean, you're saying, maybe find a safe, comfortable space, but also these very clear steps. Like step one is basically mindfulness, where we can we're looking to see the stories. And I think this sometimes is the most challenging part, right? Is the mindfulness practice itself, because people are so identified with our thoughts. We don't have that space between them unless we have cultivated some kind of mindfulness practice. But to start to see those stories, and then but maybe in a yoga practice is a good place to start cultivating that mindfulness and kind of hearing that chatter, that self-talk, and then breathe and create space. And then step 3, send yourself loving kindness. I love this. It's interesting what you said. I'm going to go back to what you said, that self-talk is all learned. Now that's kind of interesting. And I'm wondering if some people might object to that. Do you think, everything that all the thoughts that come into our head are all learned thoughts that we've learned through I guess it makes sense. It's just a way of putting it that I've never thought about, that it's not like sort of anything that's sort of unique and innate to you, right?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that comes from my feminist grounding, where where social construction of beliefs is really important. And so, from a yogic philosophy, there would be the sense that we're all whole already, right? It's all already there. But there are layers of being. If you think about the koshas, at the center is the self, the pure whole self. And there's a layer of wisdom and higher discernment. But on top of that is the sort of mind layer, the layer of all the learned messages that we get. And then on top of that is, our other levels as well. And so I think there probably is something that is inherent in us that maybe isn't learned. But in my experience of teaching for over 25 years, listening to a lot of different people's stories, that discernment, that clear wisdom, that clear empowered self is so often mired within really harmful messages, and not just about body image, but about racism, about homophobia, transphobia, about class issues. And so we really have to work to unpack some of that, especially because it's saturating us from all different directions all the time. And it doesn't stop necessarily in the yoga spaces, which is why I encouraged people not to go to a space where they think it's going to intentionally or really explicitly reinforce that for them. If you're the only person of color in the room, or you're a person of Southeast Asian descent, and the teacher is, mispronouncing Sanskrit and misusing yoga philosophy from your own culture, it's not going to be a safe space for you to do this vulnerable exploration. And the narratives that are the grief, the pain, the anger, the woundedness that's going to create, that's probably going to be the work on the mat. And so, sure, you can try to heal yourself through the yoga practice, and yoga offers you some powerful tools for that, but it might be more productive to do some of that work, for instance, in a class that is specifically for people of color, where some of that stuff may not happen, and you can feel a little bit safer to be a little more vulnerable in the space to do a deeper level of work. So I do come to this with the sense that a lot of the harmful messages we get are in fact learned messages, and that we take them so for granted, and they're usually talking to us pretty loudly before we even know they're happening, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And yoga is at least for me, yoga was one of the places where I begin to really realize that, oh my gosh, there's that chatter again, and look at how it makes me feel. That's not an empowering chatter. I just want to crawl in a corner and hide, right? And it wasn't until I got that embodied piece that I really began to be able to unlearn it. Feminism had taught me how to unlearn it intellectually, and I'd been doing that for years. But boy, howdy, it would still sink its teeth in until I found the embodied piece.
It's interesting when you were talking about the harmful messages and how they are kind of thrown at us from all sides. I got this image of someone almost covered in mud, right?
Yeah,
head to foot with these messages. But at the same time, then of course the idea of mud for me makes me remember the saying from Thich Nhat Hanh, "No mud, no lotus."
Right.
These are this mud and these difficulties and these challenges are as we work through these are the things that allow us to come forth and blossom in a bigger and more beautiful way. Now, Beth, can I take you back? We kind of jumped right into.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
No, it's okay. We jumped right into the body image stuff, which I think is so important. But I'm kind of want to hear a little bit more about your story. How did you discover yoga, and where were you in your life when you discovered yoga?
Sure. I was in graduate school in my PhD program, and being a graduate student and learning is really, really enriching, but it's also, at least at the time I went to graduate school, in some ways it's a culture of judgment. where you're taught to critique and you're taught to, see the flaws in other people's logic. And I found that it really echoed that internalized messages that I grew up learning, that my worth was dependent on external, right? And so I found this yoga class and I just tried it and I liked it. It gave me a taste of something that I clearly had a hunger for, but I wasn't able to hold it. And that happened many, many times for several years. I knew that yoga was valuable and that I always felt so much better afterwards. And it gave me that glimpse of a more, tapping into a real deeply empowered self, but it wasn't something that I could sustain or hold for any period of time. Until I practiced it on and off, sometimes more seriously, sometimes not so much. And certainly not as often off the mat. I didn't integrate it into my life, which is what I mean by I couldn't hold it. Right.
Yeah.
Until I got tenure as a professor. And that is a challenging and grueling process. It was actually really uneventful in my case, but the very process is grueling, and you never know what's going to happen, etc. And at that point, I just decided, I need to deepen my practice. And I was really into Anusara at the time. And so I did a 200-hour teacher training that was in Anusara that at the time was really transformative because I saw a lot of parallels to how I teach in feminist ways. And it took me into a much more regular process that then I do, consistently. And since then, that was, I don't know, maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago. Since then, I've been deepening the yoga practice a lot more. I no longer practice Anusara, although I still appreciate a lot of the gifts from that style. It's gotten much, much more refined, a lot more pranayama, a lot more meditation, a lot more practices into embodiment off the mat as well as on. And so now the skill sets are so much more available to me than they were when I first found it. So there was this real hunger because of the promise that not the promise, but how I would feel afterwards, right? Like I would feel more whole. I would feel more empowered.
Oh, it sucks us in, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, it's interesting because it sounds like, you're in graduate school, you're studying feminism. I mean, you're probably to some degree, like a fairly nerdy intellectual kid is what I'm imagining.
Wow. You pinpointed that in like 25 minutes of knowing me. You're good.
So yeah, I imagine that coming in, out of the head and out of that intellect and into the body was just, it must have been like a great relief.
It was, and it's one of the reasons why I decided to do the teacher training, because I was also seeing it in all of my students, my women's studies students, in very different ways. But, I think that feminism was such a gift in my life, and it's such an empowering. It itself is a practice, much like yoga is. It's a way of being in the world. But I would see my students become really empowered intellectually and politically, but still fall into the abusive relationships or the eating disorders or the addictions, as did I. I did all of those things, which said to me, we're missing something here. Right? That if we can empower our students so much and they're out there being change agents, but there's a piece in their own bodies and hearts and lives that it isn't able to seep into, then we're missing a piece. And for me, I think that piece is embodiment. I don't think yoga is the only way to do it. I think there are other ways to do it. But for me, yoga was the way that I started asking those questions about why embodiment needs to come in.
From kind of like what I'm getting from you is that the way feminism allowed you to think about the world, or the way it's being caught up by these women and students, is that it's more of an external, out in the world way of, you said it's a way of being in the world, but it sounds like it may be more external. Would you say that's correct?
Sometimes. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and some of that has to do with the fact that we're talking about feminism in higher education,
Mm.
right? So, and higher education tends to privilege the intellect over the body, right?
Oh, yeah.
So that's part of it. And feminism, of course, has disrupted that for a long time because we always talk about eating disorders. We always talk about sexual assault, and those are embodied experiences. But there was another piece that mindfulness, the self-care, the being aware of how it actually plays out in your lives, and just as importantly, cultivating empowering and healing skill sets, right, to meet those challenges. And so for me, it was yoga, mindfulness, and feminism combined that did the trick.
Mm-hmm. In your own life, how did feminism help you in your own life?
Oh, how didn't it? It helped me find my voice, and it helped me begin to see how I could make contributions in the world. It helped me begin to put a language to things that I hadn't really been able to explain before. So being able to explain why something is racist, or why something is homophobic, or something like that. And it also began, this is the piece that I think is really important. Let's go back to the conversation we had about body image. We talked about how a lot of young women, and actually many women, not regardless of age, have that negative self-talk. But so often it's seen as an individual thing, like, oh, I do this, or these people in my family do this. But when we start to get the bigger picture and we see it's so many people because it's created from a system of oppression, then we begin to understand, oh, right, it's not just us. And some people do benefit from this. And because it's socially produced, we can change it, right? I found that really empowering to me, and got a little fire lit under me. And it's just been, the way I've lived since I first founded feminism, that is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if the listener, who's hearing you say this is saying, oh, negative self-talk, and hearing his or her own self-talk, and recognizing that in themselves, and listening to you say it's created from a system of oppression, which may be in some ways, like kind of news. It's not something
Sure.
we talk about,
Yeah.
in a big way. How do you have any advice for how does a person take that? How do they then take that and work with that in their own lives?
Sure. Let me think. I'm someone who makes sense of things through examples. So let me think of a good way to address that.
Yeah, examples would be great. And to give you, in some ways, and I think it's in so many women and so many of us. I completely remember my mother looking in the mirror and saying to herself, I'm so ugly, and
Right.
Absorbing that and saying the same thing to myself as a young woman. It's
Right. Well,
sad.
let's take that example then, and let's say. Let's start with a caveat that it operates in so many different ways besides just beauty. But since you threw that out there, let's use that example. So,
Okay.
When we talk about systems of oppression, I mean patterns that operate throughout society, and they're usually reinforced through things like our media, our government, our educational system, our family system, and so on. All things that are bigger than us, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we as individuals participate in them. So that sense of someone saying, I'm ugly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, chances are that person heard her mother say it, or other women in their family say it. So it's reinforced in their family, right? As a family, the family is one of the social institutions. It's reinforced by every magazine you pick up, right? Where every women's magazine that you pick up, where, women are told, that to be beautiful, they need to buy certain products. They need to have a particular kind of body. They need to, fragment their bodies. So, does my butt look big in this? Are your thighs ready for bikini season? So there are all these articles that teach women how to look at their bodies as fragments rather than as whole. Mm-hmm. And then there are also all these messages that say you're not good enough as you are. You have to either do a practice or buy a product or aspire to something that you're not in order to achieve that value. Also, you're only valuable if you're beautiful, right? That's another message that gets sent. Yeah. And it's reinforced, and beauty is defined for us rather than by us, right? Mm-hmm. And then it's reinforced in the educational system where the pretty girls are the popular ones and they get called on in class, et cetera, et cetera. And if somebody doesn't fit the mold or is a little sassy or a little brassy or likes to challenge the status quo, she's not, quote unquote, feminine enough. By the way, all these messages are also highly racialized and highly classed, which we could also talk about. So it's reinforced in all these different ways. Of course, you're going to learn it. And in fact, this is how oppression works. It doesn't have to come from outside of us because we begin to internalize it. We begin to talk to ourselves in that way so that we participate in those messages. And I think internalized oppression is a deeply harmful way because it eats us away from within. Right? It sounds like truth in our own mind. And that's why mindfulness is so important, to begin to recognize that chatter, right? Which is always happening, and to begin to notice how it shows up. So I'll give you an example. I was in a conversation just the other day, and I said something that was maybe a little unpopular, and I caught myself. Now, mind you, I'm a feminist, right? And I've been a teacher and I've been an advocate for over 30 years, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not like I'm not new to this, or it's not like I'm new to this, but boy, it happened again. So I'm sitting there talking and I find myself rambling, saying the same thing over and over and over again because I think they don't like what I'm saying. And my face is flushing and my heart is racing. And I kind of just want to leave and go home and pet my cat. And so all these things are happening. And, instead of thinking that it's truth, my practice, my feminism and my yoga together have allowed me to say, oh, there it is again. There's that internalized oppression that says you have to please other people to be worthy. But you know what? Your voice in and of itself is worthy. And maybe some breathing practices right now would help you calm your heart rate, would help bring you back into the room and help you stay in the conversation in the way that you want to stay.
That's interesting. And I think that, there certainly are those elements of the internalized oppression. There's that self-talk that comes out. I mean, do you think that part of that also may be just like our innate human drive to be part of a tribe, to, that desire to be liked, right? I mean, that seems like very, very universal too.
Sure.
Yeah. But to be able to see that and say that this is not necessarily the truth. This is a thought that I'm having, and I can come back come back out of that spiral and into your body, to come back out of that. And I think that's exactly what you're pointing to earlier when you said that yoga can disrupt those standards, because just simply coming into the embodied experience disrupts that negative spiral in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely.
So would you say this is kind of like where feminism and mindfulness overlap, is in just building that awareness of what's going on internally?
Sure, that's one place. You become aware, you start to be able to do your own individual transformational work by unlearning these harmful messages and developing the skill sets that in the moment, right, in our everyday lives, not just on the mat, but in our everyday lives, are skill sets that let us meet those challenges in different ways, healthier, more empowering ways. That's one piece. And then the other piece that feminism almost demands, is that it can't just be individual transformation. It also needs to move to the collective transformation. So then what does that mean for how we are in community with one another? What does that mean for, sure, we want to be liked, but can we be liked by valuing our differences in our community instead of enforcing this kind of sameness, right, that often contributes to oppression? So can we value and celebrate each other's differences, racial differences, cult differences, religious differences, and so on, so that everybody can actually bring their full selves to the table. You can't have collective transformation without individual transformation, but you also can't have the reverse, right? There's a synergy between them. And so feminism allows for both of that. The other thing I guess I'll toss out there is that I'm a strong advocate of mindfulness, and I love the work you do with mindful parenting. And there's so many, there's mindfulness everywhere in U.S. culture right now, right? It's being taken up in so many different avenues, and I love that. But there's also a caveat to that, which is that sometimes, like for instance, corporate mindfulness or other kinds of mindfulness programs, there's the potential pitfall that what they invite us to do is become complacent with the way things are. So being, accept the way things are, so to speak, when the way things are actually problematic and need to be changed. And so I'm not saying all mindfulness programs do that. There are quite a few that don't, but the ones that do, we just might want to ask some questions about, anytime anything is presented as a silver bullet, that's going to fix everything. I think, we need to ask some questions about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's interesting because I'm working with a friend on the mindful parenting course that I told you about, and one of the we're looking at NBSR, and they have an NBSR, mindfulness based stress reduction. They have their the sort of 7 attitudes of mindfulness. And we were I was looking at these 7 attitudes thinking, well, do these apply to mindful parenting as well? And one of the attitudes, just like you say, is acceptance, right?
Right.
And there's a lot of problems with the word acceptance. And it's interesting because from a spiritual point of view and from I have a Buddhist background, and I can really understand the word and kind of get behind it in that sense. But I see the way it's, especially in parenting, it's kind of a red flag word, right? We don't want too much acceptance.
Right.
And looking at that word, and so in my course anyway, we're changing that sort of mindset to one of acknowledgement, like let's acknowledge what is in this moment. And then, and rather than the idea of acceptance, which has that idea, that sort of, it kind of leans towards complacency, right? Or it's linked in the popular culture and many people's minds with that, to instead bring in that word, acknowledgement.
I like that. Yeah. In my own work, of course, I would not say that we need to just accept oppression, right? No way. But I do think, I also come from a Buddhist background and yoga, and I understand how they're trying to use it. Or what it means in those contexts. And so for me, it's sort of accept your reactions to what's happening right now, which is very similar to acknowledgement in that way. Like you're allowed to feel whatever you feel. And if you start fighting against it, then you start fighting against yourself. It doesn't mean that you have to accept the conditions that created it, or that you don't want to make certain choices to change it necessarily. But it complicates it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious about so you wrote a book, and it's called Integrating Mindfulness into Anti-Oppression Pedagogy, and which is a very professorial title.
Yes.
So can you translate it for me?
Sure, of course. I mean, it's geared towards other professors, right? Because it's about, a lot of us teach social justice and women's studies, women and gender studies, ethnic studies, et cetera. A lot of us teach social justice. And so it's about how do we bring mindfulness into that teaching? How can mindfulness help us have difficult conversations in our classrooms in ways that move the conversations forward, right? And it's really about bringing that embodiment piece in, and then offering students skill sets that they can use long after the class ends, when they have these kinds of conversations. So, it does sound very academic because it's geared for an academic context. I do hope to write a more popular book, sort of more public book in the future, that has less wordy titles, but yes. Thank you for asking about it.
So what does your practice look like in your own life? What how do you practice to have a more empowered relationship with your body and in your life?
Sure. Part of that depends on what time of year it is. If it's the middle of a semester, sometimes it's a lot of yoga nidra and restorative yoga because I need that nourishment. Right. My head tends to go a lot. I'm very vata, so I'm kind of all over the place and I need the grounding.
Can you just quickly translate vata
Sure.
for those who are not familiar
Sure.
with it? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an Ayurvedic dosha term, and dosha just kind of means your constitution. And vata is one type of constitution. And for vata means it's an elemental thing that relates to air and ether. And so when you're in balance, you're creative, you're spontaneous, you're able to put connections together. But when you're out of balance, you're really spacey, you're kind of all over the place, you're ungrounded. And that describes me precisely.
Oh my God, that's so me too.
So there are certain times of the year because of my work schedule that is really likely to happen. And when I am out of balance, then I'm not skillful in what I do. I'm not able to be skillful in having hard conversations, or those negative self-talk narratives will be much more effective. I'll be less able to interrupt them or notice them because I'm not grounded. Right. Mm-hmm. So during those times, I do a lot more restorative yoga nidra, slow practices, more meditations to give myself that nourishment. Other times, like summer, I'm taking the summer off for the first time, and I can't even tell you how long.
Good for you.
Thank you. I needed some self-care, and so it's more rigorous. Hatha practices. It's kind of whatever I feel like I need that day. But I do try to do it, if not every day, then every other day, because I need the grounding.
So just getting on your mat, I'm picturing this in your home by yourself, a very personal practice. Yes.
And part of that is because I teach an hour away from where I work, so getting to a studio is not always easy. No, let me rephrase that. I teach an hour away from where I live. So on the days that I have to drive, I just can't get to a studio class. But, I do have a good home practice, and that has been a real gift.
Yeah. I think that's important. I mean, part of the way we conceive of yoga here in our culture is that it must be a 75 or an hour, 90-minute class. It must be at a studio. It must include sun salutations, and it doesn't necessarily have to include any of those things. It may look very different and feel very different in different days. And I think that's part of what I want to open up the listener to in this podcast is that yoga can have a lot of different permutations, and how it serves you.
And one of the real gifts yoga has given me because of that embodied piece and really embodied mindfulness piece is the ability to really turn inward and say, what do I need today? Right. And then because I've studied enough that I generally can give myself what I need that day. Right. I know enough that I could do a yoga nidra, or, I do it with a recording. So you don't have to think, you can just sink into it. But that ability to really tune into yourself and say, what is it I need today? Do I need energizing? Do I need grounding? Do I need both?
Mm-hmm. So when we think about the listener and, absorbing all these messages about feminism, yoga, about our cultural standards and how harmful they've been, and about thinking about, maybe the listener thinking about their own relationship to their body. What advice do you have for somebody who's interested in kind of exploring some of these issues, or maybe cultivating a better relationship with their own body and in their own lives?
Sure. I would suggest searching out some of the people who are doing this really exciting work around yoga, body image, social change work. And there are a lot of great people listed on the Yoga Body Image Coalition website. It's YBIcoalition.com. And searching out some of that work, because while I talk about how all these negative cultural messages are out there, those are really the dominant messages. Fortunately, the access of the internet means we can also search out really empowering ones, and those are out there too. They just get less airplay, right? So really searching for people doing amazing work would be, one part of it. Two, honoring that it's a process. Some days are going to be easier and better than other days, and to just, what mindfulness teaches us, be curious about it rather than judgmental about it, right? Maybe even journal about it. So you can look back at the shifts and begin to know yourself, right? Like sometimes in the year, maybe you'll find that you tend to, have the same kinds of negative thoughts, and other times of the year you have more empowering thoughts, and just knowing that about yourself, can be really helpful. Being gentle and kind and patient with yourself, also really helpful. This isn't necessarily easy work because it's kind of like digging up weeds. You have to unearth the negative message and then actively cultivate more empowering self-care and loving messages. And surround yourself with people who are doing that as well, so you can support one another. And, sometimes hearing it from someone who loves you is different than hearing it from yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that idea of the, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about that we take in all kinds of nourishment, and we take in, not just food, but also conversations and movies and books are also types of nourishment that we take in. And I, for me, that's very helpful to think about it that way, because, and sometimes my husband and I joke about it, like if we're watching Game of Thrones, or like, oh my God, is this nourishing the peacefulness in me?
Right.
But indeed, it's something to think about. Like, is this whatever, your media diet is that nourishing, good things in you? And it may be that you're, sometimes you just wanna like flip through whatever at the doctor's office, and that's fine, but you just might want to have that mindfulness of how does this affect you? And it's kind of like, and I like what you said about not being judgmental of yourself. Sometimes we think, I've been practicing yoga for so many years. Like I shouldn't ever like feel angry, or I shouldn't ever like, I shouldn't ever like, one thing I think that this thought comes up after people have been practicing a while, like I shouldn't, it shouldn't be difficult. It shouldn't be hard to do this because I've been doing this for so long, and it changes so much over time. And sometimes it gets harder, after many years, and it's okay. It doesn't have to be a certain way.
Yeah. It's like peeling back an onion or trying to weed out a dandelion. In some ways, the surface is the easiest part. But we tend to think that an advanced yogi is the one who can stand on one finger upside down with every limb behind their back, right? Because that's the emphasis that often is placed in U.S. mainstream yoga world. But I think an advanced yogi is the one who can do that work with compassion, and loving kindness to themselves and others. I think that's the much more nuanced work than any particular, physical yoga pose.
Absolutely. I'm in complete agreement. No controversy here.
And it's not always hard. Sometimes it's joyful.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And it's exciting to see the work that all these other people are doing. I've watched this amazing video on Facebook of this woman, a real curvy yoga mama who was like doing this amazing practice. And it was like, beautiful,
Yes,
and for me, I'm interested in so many types of bodies, and I like that, that idea of, even looking at your studio, is this a place that encourages difference? Is this a place that encourages, you can see that down to, even the way a person teaches a class or a specific pose. Do they allow you to have variations on your pose? Are you allowed to, if you do something that's a little different, are you getting the dirty look? That's indicative of, a rigid place. Maybe let's find somewhere with some more, openness and openness
Absolutely.
to difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'd like to think that we are at a cultural tipping point in the U.S. mainstream yoga world around that. I think there are so many conversations happening right now that I hope will shift how yoga is taught and who constitutes the U.S. yoga world. I'm hoping that shift is happening now.
I hope so too. It's interesting because I feel like I'm kind of in the middle of these two places in some ways, because I teach at a couple studios, and one studio, the owner is Gwen Sofer. She's part of Yoga Body Image. She's an amazing teacher, and she's helped that studio. Like, we use permission stones in that studio so that nobody is being touched without their permission. Which, now that I have converted to this way of teaching, it's like seems like such a duh kind of thing. Right. Hello, why are we just touching people? But I can absolutely see the other point of view too, because I lived that for so many years, that's part of what we do as teachers, is give assists and things like that. But and so the other studio I have, I use the permission stones in my class, but it's been challenging to, I've invited the owner to bring it into the whole studio. Let's have a conversation about this. Let's talk about this. But there's I think yoga has a lot of traditionalism too, and in some ways you'd think we'd be very flexible, right? It's like there's that balance between the way yoga is changing and the sort of very traditional that goes back to, what we think is thousands of years, but maybe is only back to Russian gymnastics at the turn of the century kind of thing,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's a pattern that happens with a great deal of cultural change. So part of my hopefulness comes from, okay, this is what happens. People start to create change, and then other people cling to the way it's been, and it begins to shift in increments.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that too. I appreciate that bigger perspective giving. So, Beth, it's been really, really lovely to talk to you. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
Sure. You can check me out at bethberila.com.
Only one L.
One L, yes, Berila. Or I've also created a website called The Mindful Semester. So themindfulsemester.com, and that's for college students who maybe want to, or anybody connected to college, maybe want to learn a little bit more about what yoga can do in their lives. And then, of course, the Yoga Body Image Coalition has a lot of great information and a lot of fabulous people. If you're looking for someplace to connect with more conversations around this, I'd start with the YBIC website.
Yeah, and I'll be linking to that in the show notes.
Great.
On
Thank you.
yogastoriesproject.com. I'll have links to all of that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting this conversation. It's been great chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Beth. I appreciate it. Did you love talking to Beth Berila about feminism and yoga? I think they're both so empowering. I hope that you really enjoyed this episode. If you ever have any questions about the podcast or about the guests or whatever, you can email me at hunter@hunteryoga.com. And I want to thank William Fields for the music. He does a great job. And I also want to just put in one more plug to ask you to leave an iTunes review. Like I said, we're starting fresh here. Oh my gosh. So leave an iTunes review, please, now, if you could. I'd love your honest review. And another way to support the podcast is just to tell a friend about it. And so I hope you have this podcast inspired you, and I hope you have a really wonderful week. Namaste.